Hello everyone, OG Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called A is A. This is a paper I've been working on, I guess, since I was 21, which is really just thinking about why is it that Aristotle's A is A seems so undeniably correct and yet at the same time incomplete. Why is it the case that if we say that a thing is a thing, that it kind of is like, well, of course, the law of non-contradiction, and yet at the same time, it seems to be a model which, has its use, but at the same time, doesn't really seem to describe very well the world we live in, except on maybe a single dimension, on a single plane. If A is A, then irony, contradiction, paradox, all these things shouldn't be possible. And yet we live in a world in which they are possible. And so, I think part of the issue, if we actually take the formula itself, A is A, and try to break it down, and forgive me if this is hard to explain verbally, hopefully the paper shows this, though admittedly it's never easy when you're dealing with these kind of logic things. But, if I say a cat is a cat, well, then I can go cat, right? Well, if I go cat, then I go cat, 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 it just kind of goes on, right? It's sort of what's called an eternal regression. The fact that a cat is a cat is a cat is a cat, it goes on, it's ad in infinitum, and it's an eternal regression actually more so because if I go, a cat is a cat, well, what's a cat? Well, it's an animal with paws. Say, okay, what is that? Well, it's something made of atoms. Okay, what are atoms? Well, electrons and neutrons. You see how it kind of regresses into itself and into its parts, and at what point does the cat emerge out of the parts? Well, it's hard to say, but you see, the cat, in order to be the cat, has to be made up of a lot of things that the cat is not. And so if a thing is itself, then it is itself thanks to things that it cannot be reduced to. And so the phrase A is A must actually kind of mean A is not A, in parentheses, A is not A, in parentheses. That the thing that is a thing that is not itself. That we can't locate that central identity of cat by which we refer to the phenomenon. And so A is A really kind of signifies something more like A is not A is not A. Now, I'm not saying that stuff doesn't exist. Instead, I'm saying that things exist in a kind of tension, the sort of weird, regressive, and yet infinite tension on where things indeed are. They do, in fact, exist, and yet they don't exist primarily in the ways that we tend to think they do, by which we tend to engage them. So things are ultimately not what they are. But at the same time, we could posit a theoretical entity that actually is itself, that is simple, that is not composed of any parts. And that would be something that truly is an A is A. It is full in itself. It is not something that signifies beyond itself. And that we could refer to as B, this thing that is itself entire. Well, that would mean that A is always going to be without B, because A is always something that I think about. And the moment I'm thinking, because there is no syllogisms in nature. And the moment I am thinking about my cat and trying to decide what my cat is, then the thought is, I have the thought of cat, and then I have the thing that is cat, and I understand the thing that is cat through the thought of cat, of which the thing is not. So I'm always understanding the world through things it is not, and yet identifying them with those things that it is not. And so in one sense, there's the idea of cat to the idea of cat, which is a kind of A is A that is complete. A B, and then in a sense, and then I have the thing that is a cat that is itself, which in its sense is a B. But the moment I think about it, then I am taking two A is A dimensions and putting them together, and the dimensions don't equal one another. And so that's where the A then becomes an A that isn't A. So then A is A becomes A is not A without B, without a dimension in which these things are themselves without any tension. And so I have to go through life always thinking about things as they are not in order to understand them. And the moment I do that, then identity is inherently unstable. It is inherently something that is a tension. And so things that are tensions, of which are oriented toward be. Things are trying to be themselves without any notness per se, without any nothing, if you will. But of course, be relative, a thing that is entire to itself, is never a point which entities that never arrive at themselves arrive at. And so be is always an ideal that things are toward, and in that sense it's a kind of nothing. But of course, nothing does not exist by definition. Nothing means no thing. So if the word nothing ever means anything, it is always going to be a kind of orientation of a thing that is, an impression, an appearance, but not a thing in itself. So when I think of my cat, I'm using something the cat isn't, an idea, to understand it. And when I so try to understand it, I make it toward a state of being itself in of itself, of which the cat never is. In other words, I use a thing that is not a cat in order to understand what a cat is, and yet a cat is never reducible, is always a collection of things that is not, and yet in order to understand the cat, I have to treat it as if it is a thing that is whole in of itself, a be. So I cannot actually exist in the world treating things as if they are unstable, and so I always engage and think about them as if they are stable, and so I'm engaging in a sort of almost self-deception, a kind of self-deception that thinking must engage in order to make the world conceivable. But therefore, the conceivable world in which I exist in is always unstable. It is always concealing. It is always prone to irony, because I am knowing things. In order to know things, I know them by what they are not, and thus it is prone to paradox and contradiction. And so I am always thinking that I am engaging in the world with a kind of pure reasoning, a sort of A is A reasoning, but I am not. I am engaging in the world through a lens of which cannot be found in the world, without which the world would not be there meaningfully to me. And so this is the kind of complicated ontological and logical games that we are constantly engaged in, that we frankly can't really be conscious that we are engaged in, otherwise it would overwhelm us. And yet without these sort of mechanisms, I couldn't handle myself, and I couldn't handle the things around me, because they would be very difficult to grasp, and I couldn't refer or signify anything if I didn't overlook the technical details. There's that box phrase we've mentioned before on the idea that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And certainly A is a useful model. But it is quite important to understand that all quote-unquote identity, all thought, all meaning, all of these things are modeling, that I exist in a world that is a model, that is not equal to the world. And of course people, generally know that if you ask them directly. But the thought fades away in consciousness as soon as we go about living our daily lives. And since our understanding of the world is a model, of which we must necessarily treat as if it is actual, otherwise the model wouldn't work very well, then I'm always susceptible to moments in which the world breaks through my model and unveils what is actually there. And if I get to the point where I think the model is real and the world is fake, then I can try to save my model in the name of trying to keep the truth, and thus we have the endless joke of irony, the endless quest of Don Quixote, per se. So anyway, A is incomplete, and this also, of course, has ontological ramifications. I do tend to think that logic and ontology are very difficult to separate, because if A is a thing that it is not, then in a sense we can say A is nothing, because it is a thing that it is not, and thus a relative nothing, a conditional nothing. And it is, so things are, they do in fact exist, they are nothing toward something being itself. things are nothing toward something being itself, a version of itself being itself. And so there's always, when we exist as beings, we're always relating to a conditional nothing, by which makes possible an orientation toward a thing that is complete in of itself, of which we never reach. But if we were not toward, we would have no way to stabilize the inherent tension of our own ontology, and thus couldn't be at all. So anyway, that's A is A by O.G. Rose. For more, please check out ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.